All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get things started here. It looks like we have quite a few people that have already entered, and I'm sure as others enter, they can kind of catch up as we go forward. I just want to thank everyone for coming to this quarter's Ministry Advisory Council, and I'm just pleased that we get to bring something of value to our members with having Erika Cole, the church attorney, come and be with us. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to pray for us to get us started, and then I'll go into introductions into Erika. So, Father, I just thank you for this time. I thank you for the ministries that we get to serve. Lord, may this be a time to bring enrichment and value to them. May this be a time where Erika can share her wisdom and knowledge to us, and that we can learn from it. Father, I just thank you for this day. May we glorify you in everything we do, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to make an introduction to Erika Cole, the church attorney. One thing I know is that she shares the same heart that we do. We, as we like to say here, is we want to serve ministries in all life stages of ministries, whether that's the church plants or those that are in succession planning. And that is actually a lot of the things that Erika helps out with. And I think that's where the big connection here. It's our heart to bring value to our members, and this is one of those things that we can do here. So the Ministry Advisory Council, we're set to do that. And what I want to do is pass it over to Erika Cole. She's going to go into a presentation. As she goes into presentation, she'll walk through everything. At the end, we'll have some Q&A. If you do have any questions that you have for her, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And I'll actually go ahead and ask her those questions at the end. And I'll also talk about this at the Q&A portion. So Erika, I'll pass it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike, for having me here. I'm grateful to be with Christian Community Credit Union, with your advisory council, and obviously the work that you do is fantastic and so greatly needed. I'm going to be talking today about top legal issues for churches and nonprofits. And we're not just going to talk about the problems. I'm going to share some practical solutions that I think can be of help and of a very useful nature. I'm here actually on the East Coast, right outside of Washington, D.C. I've had the pleasure of working in the area of representing churches and faith-based organizations for over 24 years. And again, not only just doing the work, but also, I was raised in the church. I always tell the story that literally my mom was my Sunday school teacher, and my dad was the head deacon and trustee of our church. And I'm married to a minister. So my commitment to Jesus Christ and the fact that, I'm so grateful that he's my heavenly father, and to be able to be a person of faith that is just a blessing. And I was one of those people who knew at a very young age, it was like 10 or 11, that I wanted to be an attorney. But God really did a beautiful thing in my life, that he connected my passion for the law with my heart for the church. And so as a Christian attorney, I'm grateful that I'm able to really be aware of the challenges in a unique way and be able to bring value to faith-based organizations. We've already prayed, so I'll move on. And a part of the way that I do that is obviously, I actively practice law for 24 years, and I recently, transitioned to focus more on training others. And so I do trainings like this for organizations, as well as I teach a masterclass to help other attorneys know how to represent churches effectively. And some people might say it's crazy to sort of give away the secret sauce, right, of my career's work. But I feel very strongly that now more than ever, churches need to have sound support and sound advice. And so I'm thankful to serve in this way. I also created a course called Take the Next Call, which is a 6-week course for pastors, for church leaders in burnout. And we have seen in real time how much the exhaustion, the fatigue, the challenges associated with pastoring has impacted church leaders. And so I'm grateful to have created this course and to get feedback that it's been so helpful. I just want to say one of the biggest blessings is when I taught this course earlier in the year, I literally had a wife of a husband tell me how much she appreciated the course in tears, which is getting me in tears. So I'm really thankful for the way God has chosen to allow me to be of service. Also, the Church Law podcast that is on the Christianity Today podcast network, and again, is a fantastic resource. Upcoming next week, next Thursday, September 22nd, is the Church Compliance Conference, which I created 15 years ago. It is an event for pastors and church leaders, executive pastors, folks who work in finance with church. So we would love to have you there. I'm a lawyer, so of course I've got to have my disclaimer here. So of course the presentation and these materials that you're seeing are provided for general information purposes and are not at all intended to be legal advice. So here we go, let's jump in. I've got probably at this point a good 22 minutes or so to talk through these top 5 areas of legal issues for churches and nonprofits today. And then we have some time. I'll turn it over to Mike when we get to the Q&A portion. So I want to start off when we talk about legal issues. Honestly, these are things that I have seen in 24 years of legal practice, things that I have observed being a part of the church myself. And I'll start off with a significant one, and that is compliance issues. So when we talk about compliance issues, or specifically even the area of compliance, it covers any number of arenas. Number one, we're often thinking of federal compliance, right? So that is everything from the federal courts, the judiciary portion. Of course, we know the top court there would be the Supreme Court. So rulings that have a direct impact on churches and that would require their compliance from the judiciary, from the Supreme Court or other federal courts. Also on the federal side would be the Internal Revenue Service. And that is of particular significance because churches and nonprofits are uniquely positioned, and in some ways, I would say uniquely challenged because of the requirements for tax-exempt organizations. Not necessarily always that the requirements are extremely onerous, from my humble opinion, but often the challenge of making sure that churches know and understand what the requirements are and are able to effectuate them. I often find that, churches want to do the right thing. They just may not have the right information or have the resources at hand to do so. So with the Internal Revenue Service, it can involve things like applying for tax exempt status, the decision of whether to even apply for tax exempt status. We know that churches are the only tax exempt organization or the only entity that's presumed to be tax exempt without having to apply. However, an organization can only demonstrate it is an exempt organization if it has that letter of determination in hand, if you've actually applied for and received the letter of determination manifesting your exemption. So whether I get the question sometimes like, well, maybe our church shouldn't apply for tax exempt status because then we won't have to follow the IRS rules related to tax exempt organizations. Not true. The rules apply to churches and nonprofits. It's really just a matter of being able to have proof that you're exempt. And under that is making sure that all of the rules related to tax exempt status are followed, right? As I've explained, whether you apply for exemption or not, churches are presumed to be exempt. And so they are required to follow matters related to not having substantial lobbying, or not having being involved in political campaign activity. There's also rules related to what's called private annulment or private benefit transactions. So as a credit union, and you're likely reviewing the finances of an organization, the consideration around who is compensated and how much those individuals are compensated, that can actually come under not only just good financial practices and protocols, but also ensuring that it does not violate annulment or private benefit clauses. And then, of course, special rules surrounding the compensation of ministers. Thankfully, the ministerial housing allowance still applies. It's still a huge benefit that ministers get to take advantage of. Honestly, it has been strongly challenged and seems to continue to be challenged. And so I hope that it's something we'll still have for the foreseeable future, but something we know we have now. And so I certainly do encourage churches to take advantage of that benefit, at the same time being certain that they are operating in compliance in its application. Another area that we find under the area of compliance issues is not just on the federal side, right, which we've covered. As I said, that includes the federal courts as well as the Internal Revenue Service, but also state compliance. So state compliance, I have the corporations and associations article for the annotated code in my state, but every single state has a code, a state code that outlines all kinds of compliance requirements for legal entities, and that would include generally churches. The language may say something like religious corporation, or it may say faith-based corporation, or it may just be under general nonprofit rules. But compliance on the state side is also needful. And that can include things like making sure that you keep your principal address current. That's a general requirement. Make sure that you have in place, and again, keep current, the name of the resident agent, or some states call it a registered agent. Most states also have regular filing requirements. And this could be an annual filing requirement, or some states is biannual. But it essentially is a requirement in order to keep the entity in good standing or in good compliance with the state. So these are things to be considered on the state side. All right, so I'm going to move on to compliance issues related to property matters. And boy, during COVID, since COVID, hasn't this been a significant area of consideration? What I'm finding right now, and I'd be curious if you all are seeing this in your experience as well, but obviously when the shutdown occurred, the usage of churches by and large was diminished, shall we say, and to say the least. And what I'm finding with many churches now is that, while it was understandable as we were in a unique situation of a pandemic, there obviously were some challenges as well through the legal system of whether churches should be shut down. Putting that aside, the property matters, we were seeing challenges there pre-COVID, but I would certainly say that it's been exacerbated since COVID. So statistically, Pew Research, Burnout also has some research on this related to church attendance. Again, you, I'm sure, are well aware as well that church attendance has been on a significant decline over the past 20 years. So there was even pre-COVID circumstances of maybe having more of a building than having, the need for that size of a building. And we see this even in the for-profit arena, right? Many organizations are considering right sizing, is often the language that we're seeing, or downsizing their footprint as relates to property. But churches obviously are a unique institution. So being in the DC metro area, obviously values are quite high, not California high, but high. And we're seeing circumstances where many former church buildings are being transitioned into residential purposes. So whether that is condos or something of that sort, and it's very interesting. So these property matters, how churches choose to manage the issue of maybe having more property and lower attendance is going to be very important. One of the possible considerations here, and this is something that I've talked about in a recent church attorney guide that's going to be published next week. I'm finding that within the context of church mergers, property where you have a church maybe that has more property than it needs, and you may have a church that is looking to either expand into another geographic area, or maybe it needs another campus, or maybe it needs more meeting space or space for youth activities, or maybe it wants to create a CDC or some other sort of offshoot. That has been a solution that I've seen some churches utilize in this area of property challenges. One of the other issues under this arena is churches that maybe had put off some of the needs, the repairs, et cetera, for the property. And now some of those needed repairs have more than come due, and financially, the church is too strapped to make those deferred repairs. And so considering all of those things and making a wise plan for the church's future going forward is an important consideration for churches and nonprofits. Third area of the top 5 legal issues is this area of operational failures. So what I mean by that is there is the need for operational compliance, making sure that as the church functions, as it operates internally, that it's in compliance. And so there can be some unique challenges in this post-COVID world, especially as many churches that may not have been hybrid or operated in a hybrid manner prior to COVID were sort of forced to do so. And my personal opinion is that we can anticipate churches operating in a hybrid measure, for the foreseeable future. I think it's an expectation that people have now. But then there are these operational considerations. So for example, we are now having more things that are broadcast. So you have to consider issues of copyright law and other internal operations for that. We see these new job descriptions or these new job operations for an online pastor, maybe even an online campus. And what does that mean? In pre-COVID, and again, we don't have any new rulings yet, but the Internal Revenue Service has presupposed when a church is applying for tax exemption, or as it is considering, while it doesn't define a church, but it looks at these operations, the presumption is that it would be a gathering of people in person, right? Because pre-COVID, that's what we thought of for church. Now there is more of this activity of, can church only exist virtually? And of course, now we're not just talking about online like you and I are meeting right now, but we're also looking at the metaverse. And trust me, the IRS has not had a chance to examine whether a church existing in the metaverse exists for tax purposes. And so these operational matters, how the church manages its internal controls, its internal considerations about what all of its operations, and whether it is meeting with the new way that church is done. I mean, those are going to be significant considerations as we move forward. The next thing I'm going to mention is this issue of leadership and burnout. As I alluded to earlier, we're seeing some difficult statistics around, really throughout our culture, how we're managing stress, but highlighting this in the church in particular. Unfortunately, we've seen people lose their lives, lose relationships, or find themselves in making decisions that perhaps if they were in a different space, if they were not in burnout, maybe they would not make. I did get a chance to speak to this in a former podcast. I had a guest talking really about what it looks like for pastors to be in burnout, and maybe what some of the recovery solutions are. And so when we look at this, I think a part of the solutions that I've seen my clients in the past apply that have been helpful is really having that core support system, and also some, dare we say, sort of situational awareness as well on behalf of the leader, because it's very easy in a hard charging role where everyone is looking to you to find yourself, maybe more extended than one would hope. But a lot of times, as we track back some of the challenges or some of the moral failures that have been experienced in the church, there's a very close link to leadership and burnout. And so having internal operations where there is clearly thought out and thoughtful ways of being of service to the leadership, and having ample supports there, I think is really critical. I mentioned again, working with pastors through the Take the Next Call course. A part of the challenge too is sometimes pastors feel that they can't change, like they are sort of in this position forever, even though maybe the flame has gone out. So it's just really being able to look at the matter with compassion and some clear supports there. All right, so I'll get to the fifth and final of the top legal issues for churches and nonprofits, and that is missing, or the absence of, essential policies. Essential policies. So obviously policies are really meant to ensure that there is a clear path forward when the specified action occurs. So, for example, a child protection policy. It is just a given at this current time. At this juncture, judges, the court system, insurance carriers, they expect that a church or nonprofit is going to have a child protection policy. And so it's really critical that these essential policies are in place. Another essential policy is a financial policy. A financial and perhaps also an investment policy, depending upon how the church operates with its finances. But the financial policy is going to address things like how we collect, where resources are maintained, how checks are signed, who has authority to access information, etc. Another essential policy is related to social media. Of course, social media is a paramount way that people get information today. I think there's actually statistics that show people get more news from social media than from traditional news outlets. And I think it's much the same way that people get an impression of the church and other organizations. So having a social media policy is critical. I've often run into the situation where, let's say a leader or an individual leaves the church and that person is the one who had access to the social media account. So then people are trying to figure out how to access the account. Maybe this individual is posting information that is not desirable. But again, having a social media policy and having clarity around the church's perspective on that. And even if a church has a leader or probably a church leader that maybe has a very strong social media presence and a strong following on social media, how that interacts with or connects to the church, again, that's all a part of the policies that we want to have worked out in advance. Running out of time here, but I'll mention one last policy. And this one is particularly appropriate because some of the most seminal case law actually came out of California, and that's a counseling policy. It's really important that if a church performs marriage counseling or any other kinds of counseling, that they have a policy in place. I'm of the position that it is advisable to reference it as biblical counseling, because when any individual holds him or herself out as a counselor, then there is the possible risk, and that risk is greater in some jurisdictions than others, that by performing or providing counseling, that the individual is holding him or herself out to the standard that is required by licensed counselors. And that can be, a real challenge. And so having a counseling policy where you've anticipated the requirements of your jurisdiction and that you have a policy in place to address those legal pitfalls is really going to be the key there. So I do want to mention, and I think maybe Mike also referenced it, but I am grateful to have created a conference called the Church Compliance Conference back in 2007. So we're looking at our 15th annual event. It's free, it's live, it's virtual, and I think we have about, when I checked, it was over 1,000 churches and registrants that will be there. So we invite you to attend. If you want to scan the QR code, it will take you to the registration page. Again, it's free to attend. It's a live event, and it is virtual. It starts at 11 Eastern time. So we moved it back a bit later to make sure that we could accommodate the West Coast. I think in the past we've had people from all 50 states, so we would love to have you there. The Take the Next Call 6-week course that I mentioned, again, be happy if I could be of service in that way. And the season 3 of the Church Law Podcast just launched yesterday. So I interviewed Michael Martin, who is the president of ECFA, and we addressed one of the operational concerns that we mentioned earlier, which is setting accountability plans for pastors. It's a complex matter, can be difficult to address, but I've already gotten fantastic feedback. So again, this is a great and free resource that I would encourage you to enjoy. And if you want to scan the QR code, then you can get to that actual release. If not, again, it's on Spotify Church Law. So I'm going to turn this back. I'm going to stop sharing and turn this back over to Mike. Sorry, I went a couple of minutes over, but happy to hang around and answer any questions.
Yeah, so if any of you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A or in the chat, one of the two. I'm checking both of those, but I do have a few questions for you that we see often from ministries. One of them is the discussion of 501c3 versus the 508c. And we're getting a lot of ministries coming to us that are not wanting to go the 501c3 route. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to get your feedback on that, because we're kind of working through this ourselves internally of how do we manage through those that don't want to go the 501c3 route.
I'm curious, what are people telling you why they're considering the 508?
Yeah, so what we're hearing the most is because that's the number one question. Why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. They don't want to, so they want to go unincorporated. They don't want to incorporate. And they also feel that they don't have the limitations on the political aspects of the 501c3. Those are the two main things I hear from ministries that are going that route. And this has been a mind bender for us in regards to how do we handle these situations. And so I'm really curious your point of view on this. Is it a viable route for ministries? Is it something that they should be avoiding doing and just going the traditional route? I'm just curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. At a prior conference when we were meeting in person, I actually invited an IRS auditor that works specifically with churches and nonprofits, and it's interesting. So one, again, I'll rely on my disclaimer. I'm not giving advice, because I think every situation has to be examined, on its own. I generally have not had clients who've said, they want to go the 508 route. My reading of the statute is that it is particular to entities that have revenue, which the IRS calls gross receipts, of under $5,000. So I've not, I've not applied under that statute. I've done hundreds of 501c3 applications, and but yeah, I've not had clients who wanted to pursue that, which is why I asked about that specifically. And also, I know that the question of whether to incorporate can sometimes be an issue for churches, or a strong consideration, because the view, as people have explained it to me, the view is that it gets them into entanglements, with the government, and they don't want to be in that position. As I have explained, that generally speaking, it's sort of like we get a property deed, right? There is some low level of governmental activity. I think it is a relatively low level. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say specifically about 501c3 is that churches, whether you apply for exemption under 501c3 or 508, churches are essentially required to adhere to the regulations of the IRS. If you didn't apply at all, right, it's still required. So I think I would want to better understand, maybe there's some insight as to how 508, which I see as 508c1a, would invalidate that.
Yeah, no, and I actually, you make a good point, because I think from what I understand, they still are required under the IRS to still file, depending on the nonprofit and what type of activity they're doing, which actually goes to one of the questions that just came through. Dennis is asking, if an org has a letter of determination as a tax exempt church, are there annual IRS filing requirements? If yes, are there penalties for not filing in prior years?
Very good question. Very good question. So in true lawyer firm fashion, it depends, right? Generally speaking, and the reason why I say that is that it's going to be important that you review your letter of determination. As a general matter, churches are the only legal entity that are not required to file Form 990s. As a result, well, there are a number of benefits, but not having to file a Form 990 is a huge one. As you know, this information return it's a public document, number one, so that is generally not something that churches would appreciate, right? Number two, it takes a good bit of time and effort for an accountant to complete this form every year. Some nonprofits I'm aware of say it takes 6 months of their year to get these returns done, these 990s done each year. And so it takes a bit of staff power, which of course translates to money. So churches generally are the only entity that's not required to file a Form 990 as it stands. I will say there has been some challenge to that, but as it stands. The reason why I say it depends, though, is because I have found that when someone other than maybe a profession who knows this area very well completes a tax exempt application, I've seen situations where they've completed it as something other than a church. So maybe a ministry or something else that does not meet the requirements under, and I may be getting into the weeds here, but a 1023 application, which is the 501c3 application, if you're applying as a church, you have to complete what's called Schedule A. When that is not done, you might have status as a tax exempt organization, but not under the section governing churches where all of these other benefits apply.
Gotcha.
So assuming that it's actually a church, then the 990 would not be required, but you would want to look at that letter of determination to clearly ensure that you're in the right statute there.
No, that's great. And yeah, I think like you started off, it all depends, right, on the church and even how they're functioning too, because churches become pretty broad in activities, and some of them can actually blend into the ministry side where could be a depends, right? So I totally agree with you on that.
For that, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, so exactly as you suggested, I have I've worked with a number of churches that, in addition to the church, they have maybe a child care center, a school, a church operated school, maybe a CDC. Like those things are likely separate entities that may require their own separate, again, this is going to be an analysis that each organization will have to do, but to the degree that for liability purposes, you keep them separate, then they may apply for their own exempt status. And those kinds of entities generally are going to be required to file a 990.
Yep. Thank you. Next question is actually coming from Calvary Chapel Magazine. This is specific to them. They said, we're currently facing a challenge with our state on sales tax exemption. They had it in Virginia for 20 years, but looks like Nevada is not willing to extend to them the sales tax exemption. They send us the overall NRS, but not the specific reason that we are being declined. Any recommendation can be provided on what they should do and how they should handle something like that?
That is so interesting. I have to tell you that when I started in this arena, over 20 years ago, and if you just fill out the sales tax exemption application and you sound like you have a religious name, it was like approved. It was just a given. But as you can imagine, as maybe the amount of growth of some churches, the size of some churches, maybe the scope even of their impact. And I wouldn't even just say churches, I would say schools, universities, other nonprofits. And as states became more strapped for funds, they really examined much more closely these exemptions. And so I'd be very curious as I look at this, because I don't know where the magazine is based. Sorry, are they based, because it says Virginia, but it also mentions Nevada.
I think that they may have moved. I think they moved from they're
Okay,
in
so
Nevada.
they're
They
based
just
in
they just
Nevada.
put it in
Thank
the
you.
chat. So they're in
Okay.
Nevada.
Yep. And so this goes back to exactly what I was saying. Remember when I sort of held up this book and I'm like, every state has its own statutes, its own codes. So I would encourage you, maybe they're not telling you the basis, but if you have not read the actual chapter and verse of the requirements, like I would literally go to the code. I mean, what I'd probably do is try to engage competent legal counsel in that jurisdiction. But if you want to read it yourself, I would encourage you to actually go to the code itself, because it's going to tell you what the requirements are for an entity to meet the sales tax exemption. And I mean, frankly, I can't imagine why you wouldn't. As I understand what Calvary Chapel Magazine does and who you are, with the presumption of having a letter of determination. And so maybe that's the thing. I have found that many states that used to just allow you to complete the application and say, yes, we're a church and this is where we function, or yes, we're a faith-based organization, or yes, we're a nonprofit. Now they want to see the letter of determination. So I don't know if you don't have a letter of determination, I have seen that be a stopping point.
Okay. No, I think that's helpful. A question that and this is interesting. My background is commercial lending, so I've worked in the commercial lending field. And what we do on commercial lending is we typically require a LLC, special purpose entity, for each property that they own. So to avoid commingling of assets, also liabilities of those assets coming together. One of the questions we're finding with ministries, especially as they go to multi-site, is should they be forming LLCs for each site? Because if something happens in one site, it does not impact the other site. I'm curious this has been a back and forth discussion with some ministries out there. Some have done it on their own and have started forming LLCs. And we have others that are just one entity kind of just doing it. And so just curious to get your insight on that in general.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have seen this issue quite a bit, and I've done a lot of commercial closings for churches, so I can certainly speak to this. I also have represented denominations with hundreds of church properties. So you have to always be mindful of liability concerns, but without going to the commercial law treatise, I would say that there's generally two I think reasonably healthy schools of thought here. So on the one hand, you may have the creation of one holding company. That holding company actually holds the significant assets, those property assets of the organization. And then on the other hand, you create your operational entity, which probably doesn't have a whole lot of value, but that's what's signing on the dotted line for everything, right? So you have created this legal firewall. They are distinct entities. Basically, the purse is over here, but the operations are here, so you're keeping them separate. Yep. So that's a school of thought that has generally been healthy. And I just want to recognize that the law doesn't provide a solution for every problem. Right. As a lawyer, I would love it if that were the case, but it doesn't. So we kind of have to give it our best effort. And I think that's a reasonable approach that some organizations have taken. On the other hand, there may be an approach that's more closely akin to what you described. And I see this happen whether you're talking about, individuals who invest in property, so if they buy 100 Main Street, then it's going to be 100 Main Street LLC. If they buy 200 Main Street, etc. So they have a separate entity for each of the properties that they purchase. Likewise, a church may do that for each of the property that it purchases. I think that the consideration when you talk about multi-site, always the challenge is balancing risk versus having control. That's always where we're having the dilemma. So some multi-sites say we want to make sure that the parent entity has ultimate control. We want to make sure that our name is on every deed, because we don't want some, fantastic, footloose pastor over here to, sort of run off with everything. Not that that would happen, right? We've never seen that. And so it is really that management of control versus trying to minimize liabilities.
Cool. Great. No, Erika, I really thank you for your time today. I think it's been very valuable. And I would encourage all the attendees to go ahead and look at her upcoming conference. I think that would be a great way to get more in-depth information as you go forward. Also, podcast, I certainly would, I think, sign up, go check out the podcast. And yeah, no, I think this has been very helpful. I hope we hear from you soon as we go forward with other webinars, because I think you have just a breadth of knowledge that I think will help all of our ministries. And so I do really appreciate you and all that you do for ministries.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Everyone have a great day and blessings.